All right, so now that we are recording, hi everyone, welcome and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. My name is Hayla Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am thrilled to introduce you to today's event with Shawn Adair Johnston, reading from How the Blind Detective and His Seeing Eye Dog Saved the Narwhals, which released July 20th, Jill M. Lyon, reading from The Summer Festival is Murder, a Felice Bose mystery, which released August 3rd, and Kathy J. Jacobson, author of In the Secret Heart, released on August 27th. All three authors' books can be purchased through your local bookstores and online, of course, and they can be ordered on Atmosphere Press's website at atmospherepress.com/books. Please see the links in the chat. At the end of this event, we will have time for your questions. So throughout the event, if you have a question for one or two or all of our authors, go ahead and type it in the chat and we'll make sure it gets asked. During the reading, please make sure to keep yourselves muted to keep extraneous sound at a minimum. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat still for praise and yays and comments. We at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we'd love to read it. So feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com. As you may have experienced over the last year of events, virtual events, technical issues can happen. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you in advance for your patience. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to support Shawn, Jill, and Kathy tonight, or this afternoon. Let's get to it. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first reader, Shawn Adair Johnston. Shawn was born in Ontario, Canada, educated in Southern California, practiced forensic psychology in Northern California and Oregon, and is now semi-retired near a small lake in Washington. He has taught at numerous colleges, including UCLA, UC Davis, Oregon State University, and Portland State University. Since 1980, he has performed over 50,000 judicially referred psychological evaluations, mostly on juvenile and adult criminal offenders. He has published research regarding sex offenders and how to detect deception in court-ordered evaluations of criminal defendants. While he enjoyed his work as a forensic psychologist, he has never been happier than writing sci-fi/fantasy books starring Peter Straw, the blind detective, and his cohort of human and non-human friends. Shawn, the virtual podium is yours.
Mute. Okay.
We're unmuted?
Now we're unmuted.
Okay.
Yes,
I need to preface this by saying that by virtue of being blind, I'm not going to be reading out of my book, but I have drafted my computer screen reader into reading about 4 minutes of Peter Straw's description of the narwhal poaching situation and how he got involved. Fran, my wife, is then going to read about 7 minutes of a conversation between Sergeant Aristotle Jones, augmented chimp from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and Emma Fitzwater, who is an augmented porpoise who works for the Royal Canadian Navy. In that regard, let me just very quickly point out these Peter Straw mysteries take place about 60 years in the future. And as a result of all of the baby boomers who start going demented in about 20 or 30 years, there were some tremendous advances in brain technology whereby dementia was essentially cured by the invention of synthetic brain structures, saved the country a great deal of money. And somebody thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we applied this technology to dogs, porpoises, and chimps? And they did. And dogs have the intellectual capacity of maybe a 12-year-old porpoises, 18, 20-year-old chimps, maybe a young adult. So these characters are important in the books for a number of reasons, but I'll let anyone who's interested in that check that out. So here is just a few minutes of Peter Straw introducing himself.
This is the story of how the blind detective, that is, me, and his intellectually augmented seeing eye dog, that is, Watson, saved the narwhals. otherwise known as the unicorns of the sea. By no means was it just Watson and me who saved the narwhals. We had a lot of help in saving them, such as from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Royal Canadian Navy, Coast Guard, and Air Force. We also got a little bit of critical help from that big country to the south of us, and Watson and I were, however, the only civilians to play an important role in identifying and apprehending the bad guys. The world lost the wild African elephant and rhinoceros some years ago because of the value of their ivory tusks, and we simply could not allow the avarice of a small percentage of people to do the same thing to the narwhal. The criminal probe into narwhal poaching was a bit unique in that, in addition to traditional human law enforcement personnel, it utilized the talents of recently intellectually augmented animals from both the United States and Canada. Watson, my augmented seeing-eye dog, was involved in the investigation and was one of its primary heroes. Also indispensable to the success of the investigation was Aristotle Jones, originally born in California and the first augmented chimp to attain the rank of sergeant in the R.C.M.P. Equally essential to the success of the investigation was Emma Fitzwater, an augmented porpoise currently employed by the Canadian Coast Guard responsible for patrolling the St. Lawrence River. It is distinctly possible, however, that you may be wondering how in the world a blind detective could have become such an important actor in this story. How, for that matter, can a blind guy become a successful detective? Now, let me be perfectly honest, I am not the world's most humble person. Let's be real, no blind person is going to achieve significant notoriety without a lot of ability and a lot of hard work, including a fair amount of self-promotion. Before calling my investigative business the Third Eye Detective Agency, I used to ask clients to think of me as the Ray Charles or Stevie Wonder of private detectives. More than that, I acknowledge up front that my appeal to the idea that I use my quote third eye quote, the in that quote sees all quote, reflects a blatantly shameless form of self-aggrandizement. Page 8. You understand that as a blind detective, indeed as a blind person, I can win math contests, memorize the Canterbury Tales or write great poetry. I will never, however, not in a million years, win a pancake flipping contest. No matter my score on an intelligence test, because I am blind I will always need help in doing many utterly simple things such as not walking off the high cliff or into an active wood chipper. Be honest, you would never volunteer to ask me to shoot an apple off of your head in an archery contest. Things about which you need not worry because you can see what is happening around you, could get me killed. Put a little differently, no matter how smart I am, no matter how independent a thinker I am, I need the kind of help from other people that can only be described as an extreme form of interpersonal dependence. The bad thing about this is the high cost of being so dependent, but the good thing is the many people who enjoy helping someone with a disability. So, accepting reality, I am grateful for the help and love most people give each other. In that case, what I am saying is that if there is any possibility that I can enhance my reputation, get more referrals, or make more money by making some people, especially bad guys and criminals, wonder whether I really do have access to my quote third eye quote, well, give me a break. Life is hard and the illusion of a little mystical power bolstering this blind fellow's detective skills isn't hurting anybody. Besides, as this story unfolds, you just might be forced to the conclusion that every now and then I do, in fact, use my third eye. Who knows when a ghost might be present that the sighted person could not see, but the blind guy could hear. I suspect that what you want to know is the
That's Peter Straw.
Okay. So I'm going to read here from the chapter called Post-Party Parlays. So in the book, he set the stage with the crime that's happened most recently that they're trying to stop. And a group has come to Quebec City to help the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A dinner party has now just happened in which the main characters in the story have enjoyed a sumptuous meal and are now leaving, with various subgroups discussing aspects of the evening and the case. I've chosen to read the exchange between Emma, the augmented porpoise, and Aristotle, the augmented chimp, both of whom are members of the crime investigation team. Emma returned to her home using the Portmobile in reverse fashion from earlier that day, leaving from the Montcalm house and arriving back at Chez Porpoise. The new porpoise habitats in Montreal and Quebec City only had apartments for 4 permanent occupants thus far. The porpoise habitat in Toronto had apartments for 8 permanent occupants, while the very first such habitat, still referred to as the Porpoise Palace in Vancouver, had rooms for 16 permanent occupants. Though differing in size, they all followed the same plan. Whether on an ocean beach, a lakeshore, or a riverbank, a pier would extend out into the water, connecting with a large building reminiscent of a barn or boat shed. Following behind Emma's transport home, Aristotle parked his moped to the side of the short pier connecting the habitat to the riverbank. While Aristotle had spoken with some augmented porpoises during the past few years, these interactions had been limited to seminars and conferences dealing with some aspect of augmentation. By and large, Aristotle, who took things rather seriously, found porpoises to be superficial and even flippant. He thought male porpoises were particularly simple and hedonistic. He had to admit, however, that for an augmented porpoise, he found Emma genuinely thoughtful. He liked her and thought they might become friends. He had numerous friends, of course, within the primate community, including both chimps and humans, though aside from Watson, he had no other ongoing relationships with any other augmented animals. He was amused and even slightly pleased with the idea that an augmented chimp and porpoise could become friends. If he and Emma were able to overcome the extraordinary differences that separated them, he thought, what the devil was wrong with his brilliant human cousins that they could not do the same for each other? Aristotle locked up his moped and started down the short distance across the pier into the porpoise habitat. Per Emma's instructions, as soon as he entered the large and drafty building, he turned left into the living area. Emma's apartment was the first door on the right, and she had already opened her front door in anticipation of Aristotle's visit. Emma had beaten Aristotle to her room by only a few minutes. Once the pickup truck had parked above the boat ramp next to the pier leading out to the habitat, she had exited the truck bed in her Portmobile, descending directly down into the river. There, she left the specialized vehicle and swam out into the river so she could enter her room using her underwater door. Upon entering her apartment, she instructed her voice-activated computer to turn on the lights, play some recently recorded porpoise music, and discharge shrimp into the water for her, and some bananas and guavas onto the table for Aristotle. Emma's room was always well stocked. Knowing how much augmented chimps enjoyed fresh fruit, she was happy that today, even though at the time she believed she would be sharing it with human friends. Inviting Aristotle over to her place for a late evening snack was very spontaneous for Emma, though she had to acknowledge that she found him to be interesting. While she was determined to get involved in politics in a few years, like all porpoises, Emma could never turn down an invitation to a good party. It seemed like most chimps would rather sit around and think instead of having fun. Such strange animals, she thought. It was curious that even most human beings were more like porpoises in wanting to play compared to their chimp cousins, who seemed to prefer debating and philosophizing. It was nice to discover that Aristotle and Emma, both of whom were pioneers within their small group of augmented species, seemed to be forming a real friendship. Emma was relaxing in the water in her room when Aristotle arrived. Without preamble, Emma observed that at the dinner party the night before, it seemed like Pierre Gaston had it out for Aristotle. Taking a chair next to the edge of the water and picking up a guava, Aristotle said, I think that man really dislikes me, Emma. I know he is trying to make Lily believe I had something to do with Trillium's death, which is just so untrue. It seems like you and Billy have a really great relationship, mused Emma. I really like my chief of the Coast Guard, Captain Lester, and can appreciate how important it is to have a boss who is on your side. Do you have any idea who killed Trillium, though? No, replied Aristotle. I thought Pierre went out of his way to try to show that he and Trillium have a super special or close relationship. I think Pierre is a cold-hearted guy. And in the past few weeks, it just seemed like he was trying too hard to create the impression that he really loved Trillium. I just don't know. If his underhanded attempts to blame me for her death, I'm developing a real dislike for Pierre. See, I like him very much myself, said Emma. He reminds me a lot of what most male porpoises are like. I thought he seemed really full of himself. And did you notice the way he looked at and talked to Mitzi? Kind of more interested in their conversation, Aristotle confessed ignorance. I'm not really astute when it comes to the fine points of how humans, especially male and female humans, interact with each other. I'm still trying to figure out what things should be like between augmented chimps. But tell me, did you get some ideas about Pierre? I'm not sure, Aristotle, she said, but he had what humans call a smug expression when he would look at Sterling or Mitzi, like he knew stuff that other people would really like to know. He reminded me of the most obnoxious augmented male porpoise I once knew, who thought he was the ocean mother's gift to all female cetaceans, like a real porpoise sex machine. I think you should be careful about Pierre, Aristotle. I just get the feeling he's wearing a mask, and we don't really know what he's up to. Aristotle, who recognized his lack of insight into human beings, genuinely appreciated Emma's obvious emotional intelligence, as well as her willingness to share her thoughts with him. What you say makes a lot of sense, he said, and I really appreciate you helping me understand what might be happening. Aristotle went on to ask Emma if she really intended to go into politics in a few years, at which point the conversation took off like a rocket and the foundations of a new friendship began to be laid.
All right. Thank you, Shawn and Fran. Our second reader tonight, or this afternoon, is Jill M. Lyon. Jill spent decades writing all kinds of nonfiction during multiple careers in multiple areas of the country. The Summer Festival is Murder is her debut novel. She, her husband, and the four-legged members of their family live in Arizona. Jill, take it away.
Thank you. One of the problems with mysteries, as I'm sure my colleagues here will agree, is finding something to read that is exciting while not being a spoiler alert. So for that reason, I've chosen something that's fairly close to the beginning of the book, but is not something that is unexpected. I also chose a piece that is mostly narrative, simply because that seems to be a bit easier when it comes to reading than a scene that moves primarily through a whole lot of dialogue. So in my case, there isn't that much of it. So I'll get started. Amazingly enough, given the blasting heat of the day, it was already cooling off fast now that the sun was setting and the crowds were gathering. It was better to get there early. 20,000 people quickly fill up all the available space on the grass of the park, nearby hillsides, sidewalks, and pretty much everywhere else with a view. We like to find a place near the water where the shells will explode mostly overhead. We had equipped ourselves with expandable chairs, blankets, and windbreakers over long pants and sweaters. 90 degrees with no air conditioning during the day, now 50 with a stiff oceanward breeze for the evening, only on the Oregon coast in July. Although you do save money on clothes, buying all long sleeve shirts. And the trees are tall and impressively dark green against the deep blue of a coastal sky, not to mention the sparkle of the water. Like I said, trade-offs. Now the sunset was beyond beautiful, a long, slow slide from golden light to pink, then violet, into that amazing rich blue before full night. The tall trees were black silhouettes against bands of color. It always looks like the perfect camera shot, but the image never comes close to reality. I had finally learned to leave the camera turned off and just enjoy it. Up around the 45th parallel, dawn and sunset take longer than they do in the tropics. Even with the sun disappearing, we had about an hour before full dark, and it was a good opportunity for people watching, if you're into that. Most of the crowd was from out of town, and there were a lot of large family gatherings. We did wave to various friends while glancing around. Suzanne was still working near the food counter in her apron. I didn't see Becky, but knew that she was likely stationed at her ambulance in the parking lot on the other side of the midway. Since most people were sitting down, you couldn't help noticing those still standing and walking around. At least one of them looked familiar. I nudged David. Isn't that Patrick Sutton? Looks like him. He looks like he's looking for something. Or someone, maybe. I don't see Greta with him. The mayor's husband was standing close to the water and looking over the crowd, hands on hips and an annoyed look on his face. Just in case he was looking for his wife, I cast an eye around myself, I guess thinking I could shout to him and point if I saw her. However, despite the brilliance of her attire, there was no sign. After my gaze returned to Patrick, he headed up a slight knoll, I assumed for a better vantage point, and turned in a full circle himself. He then turned toward the midway and logging show area, walked through the crowd and out of our view. In watching him, my attention was caught by the music stage. It looked like George and Rita Russell were on again, although their playing was mostly drowned out by the continued noise from the midway. Long day for them, I thought. I hope they're getting a decent wage for this gig. The neon lights were coming on, giving the carnival that air of cheap excitement that looks like such fun from a distance. I wanted deeper dark to enjoy the fireworks, however, so I put all the lights to my back. I checked my watch in the dimming light, nearly 10 o'clock. Finally, the first shell heralded the beginning of the much-awaited show, and everyone left off talking to switch to oohs and ahs. A few small boats on the river contributed with air horns to show their approval. It was another great fireworks event with showers of color, good timing, and great combinations. Fireworks are among my favorite things, being about the biggest shows of sparkly stuff in existence, so I tend to concentrate overhead. But I did see the city manager at one point, leaning against a pillar of the waterfront park pavilion. He was illuminated by a bright explosion of shells and was within my normal field of vision. My brain noted momentarily that he hadn't been there a few moments before, but my attention went quickly back to the reds, greens, blues, and golds exploding above the crowd. After 20 amazingly quick minutes, the finale erupted in an intense series of shells that made me laugh with their exuberance. Then came the ringing silence that always marks the end of fireworks. We all waited in case there were any forgotten shells still to be launched, and then heard the collective exhale and the noises of thousands moving around and preparing to go. The Sheffield, Oregon Summer Festival Fireworks Show was over for another year, barring the discussions of how good it was that would take place over the next few days. David and I made the well-deserved, "Wow, that was really great," comments to each other as we folded up the chairs, put them back in their carrier bags, then shook out and folded up the heavy wool navy blanket we put on the ground. We shared out the load, then started walking toward the end of Main Street that marked the hill going home, thanking our luck that we didn't have to join the huge queue of cars trying to find their ways out of town. The hill is a pretty steep incline, not easy even unburdened. With the weight we were carrying, a stop near the top to catch our breaths was warranted. We turned back to enjoy the ocean breeze, the half moon now well to the west, and the view toward the festival, some of which was still going on, even though the fireworks were finished and most people were leaving. The right side of our view, the midway and music stage, was lit up like an aureole full of glowworms, as David likes to put it. Don't ask me where he gets these things. There would be music until midnight, as well as the die-hard teenagers determined to ride all the midway rides until they went dark. As my vision scanned the grounds, I noticed the contrasts among the neon and movement of the midway, the lesser colored light of the music stage, and the deep darkness farther to the left, where I knew the bleachers stood and where the logging show had taken place that afternoon. With the smoke from the fireworks dispersed by the easterly wind, it was a cool and beautiful night, if slightly more adrenaline tinged than most Sheffield late nights. I didn't know then. From where I stood, high on a hillside 500 yards away, I couldn't tell that with the carnival noise in the deep background, everything in the bleachers area was empty and cool and eerily quiet. The trees that surrounded the logging show area and bordered the river looked down on where people had been showing off their skills just a few hours before. They were swaying and rustling slightly in the wind heading toward the Pacific. Newly cut rounds of logs were still lying around the area, showing pale round shapes in what small light filtered in from the midway area and the half moon. I wasn't there, thankfully, to see that one of the rounds was slightly misshapen and appeared to have a frame of some kind on it. Close up, the faint light would have it shown to be a face, and the frame was a pair of dark, old-fashioned cat-style glasses, although the open eyes were no longer making use of them. The round, open mouth below the eyes had finally fallen silent. The rest of the mayor's body, strident turquoise against the dark field, was laid straight out on the ground, and she was very dead. But I didn't know then. Almost no one knew.
Okay, leaving us on that cliffhanger, Jill. That was excellent. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least is Kathy J. Jacobson. Kathy is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and Wartburg Theological Seminary. Kathy worked with troubled youth in the juvenile justice system for 10 years. Later, she worked in campus and rural ministry, as well as volunteering as a hospice chaplain. She currently lives in Monona, Wisconsin with her husband. They have 3 grown children and 3 grandchildren. She has traveled to 6 continents and all 50 states. In addition to traveling, she loves hiking, the Wisconsin Badgers, and most of all, writing. Kathy recently authored the 5-book Noted fiction series. In the Secret Heart is her debut mystery novel. All right, Kathy, go ahead.
All right. Well, I thought I would start by reading just a little bit from the back of the book. Millicent Paulson is the beloved choir director at St. John's Church, or is she? The day following the annual after Christmas party at her home, Millie is found dead, rocking the small rural community of Farmerton at its core. The last people to see her alive and the main suspects in the case are the members of the choir. Was it jealousy, an unrequited love, a grudge from the past, a guilty thief, or just a random act of violence by a stranger? In the Secret Heart, join Sergeant Joe Zimmerman as he embarks on the biggest case of his career and observes the unraveling of things kept only in the Secret Heart. December 28th, 11:30 p.m. Millie Paulson wearily patted her face dry with a soft, thick monogram hand towel. Another successful after Christmas party was in the books. As the choir director of St. John's Church Choir, hosting this event was Millie's way of saying thank you to those who faithfully shared their time and talents participating in the Christmas cantata each year. Millie gazed into the mirror. Her face looked tired and drawn. It hadn't helped that she had gotten everything ready and cleaned up all by herself. Her husband, Charles, had called early in the morning with the disappointing news that his flight from Omaha was canceled due to the snowstorm that was just now beginning outside her house in rural Wisconsin. It had socked Nebraska during the wee hours of the morning, leaving her husband stranded. He would be on the first available flight home the next day. But the party preparations and cleanup weren't the only reasons Millie felt fatigued. She sighed deeply as the delay meant it would be yet another day until she had the chance to tell Charles her news. She lowered her eyes and her hand slid down the front of the soft, bright red dress she had purchased for the party, stopping just below her stomach, and a smile spread across her face. She jumped slightly as she heard a little creak. Even though she had lived in this house for years out in the middle of nowhere, it still made her nervous when she was alone at night. Being alone had become a more regular occurrence lately as Charles kept advancing in the business world. His trips had gone from once in a blue moon to regular occasions over the past 6 months. The bones of the century-old abode groaned. On windy nights like this one, the rafters rattled and the cold air whistled through the numerous cracks and crevices, which would cost a fortune to repair. If not for the weather, the partygoers would still have been around. Normally, they celebrated much later into the night. For many of them, it was one of the few social highlights of the year. But tonight, everyone had wanted to get home before the big storm hit, some planning to stop for a gallon of milk or loaf of bread at the gas and convenience store on the edge of Farmerton before it closed at midnight. Millie heard another squeak, but dismissed it this time. She lifted her eyes to the mirror again, toothbrush in hand, then caught the sight of another image within. She gasped. It was the last breath she would ever take. December 30th. Joe wearily forced himself out of bed at 6 a.m. He sat up, which seemed to be more and more of an effort with each passing day. He had to stop eating and drinking so much. He needed to start working out. He used to be so strong and muscular. Now he was huffing and puffing up a single flight of stairs. Yesterday had been a stark reminder of how out of shape he had become. He sighed. He had to report to the sheriff's office and turn in his findings from the night before. He hadn't gotten home until almost midnight. He didn't have much to report. Nobody he spoke with the night before saw anything. Everyone had an alibi, and they were the biggest bunch of goody two-shoes he'd ever interviewed. Even so, before he left that morning, he looked over the pile of reports one last time, just to make sure he hadn't missed anything important. He started in the order he had interviewed the members of the St. John's Church Choir. And I'm just going to share a couple with you. Edward closed the door after Sergeant Joe Zimmerman left his immaculate Cape Cod on Main Street. He clucked his tongue at the dirty water pooling at his feet, the result of the snow that had melted off the officer's boots. Disgusting man, he said to himself. He walked to the kitchen pantry and brought out a roll of heavy-duty paper towels and began wiping up the mess, displaying his displeasure by hissing like a snake. He thought about the Slavic sergeant's questions. Had he seen anyone or anything unusual on his way home from the party last night? What did he do when he got home? Did he know anyone who might want to hurt Millicent Paulson? He had had no answers for that loathsome excuse of an officer of the law. He only knew what he knew, and he wasn't about to share his thoughts with someone like Joe Zimmerman. He, Edward Knight, had been the choir director when Millicent Paulson came to town. It was true that when she arrived, he had been toying with the idea of retirement. It seemed like no one wanted to commit their time to the choir anymore. People complained to Edward about his music selections. They wanted to sing more modern pieces, even praise songs. Praise songs. Beethoven and Handel must be rolling over in their graves, he thought to himself. Edward had just turned 65 and had no time for all that praise songs nonsense. He couldn't believe what passed for good church music these days. He remembered when Charles Paulson moved back to Farmington with Millicent. St. John's was Charles' home church, and they became active members right away, including joining the choir. At first, Edward was happy to have a talented and enthusiastic singer in his group like Millicent, and Charles was a reasonably good singer as well. But then Millicent began causing trouble. She spoke about how eclectic their church choir's music had been in the Chicago area where she had served as its director. They had sung every genre imaginable in their worship services. At times, they had even had dancers in the worship service. She referred to it as liturgical dance, which made it no more palatable to Edward. Millicent's comments had stirred the already simmering pot of disgruntled choir members, and suddenly people were thinking about all kinds of new possibilities. The choir members began talking about using guitars, electric guitars even, and drums, for goodness sakes, sacrilege in Edward's eyes. After several months of listening to the choir members whine and plead for change, Edward handed in his resignation. No one even tried to stop him. They had a plaque made for him and served cake the next week during fellowship time to thank him for his many years of service, and that was that. Millicent would replace him the very next week. Edward was very hurt, but became a member of the choir nonetheless. He didn't want to let them know how upset he was. He also wanted to show them his level of dedication to the music program at St. John's. And he also planned to be ready to take over the choir when Millicent fell flat on her face. But to Edward's disbelief, that never occurred. Instead, the choir gained several new members, and indeed, they sang all kinds of music. He managed to be sick or have an out-of-town commitment every time they had the praise song Sunday. He just couldn't get himself to sink that low. Well, now she's gone, he thought to himself. Maybe it's God's way of punishing her for the trouble she had caused, he thought callously. He wiped up one last drop of melted snow and carried the dirty, damp towels to the trash can. Goodbye and good riddance, he said to the garbage and to Millicent. And Donald, Donald gazed into the mirror and ran the comb through his recently dyed blonde hair one more time, admiring his reflection. He straightened his tie and tugged on the sleeves of his expensive coat. He was due in court in an hour, but needed to go to his office one last time. He had planned to stop there the evening before, but had been rudely interrupted by Joe Zimmerman. He couldn't get over how Joe had changed from high school. He used to be the envy of all the boys in their class, so handsome, strong, and athletic. Now he was just a stereotypical overweight cop who looked like he had eaten more than one too many donuts. Donald had been on the team with Joe, but spent most of the time on the bench. He was a late bloomer. He grew 4 inches in college and didn't really fill out until law school. He worked out whenever he wasn't studying and was at his physical peak when he graduated. Between his new physique and a top-notch position at the largest law firm in the area, Donald made up for his slow start by dating as many women as he possibly could. He thought nothing of going out with 2 or 3 of them at a time, making sure to go to the movies or restaurants with each in a different community. He started to gain a reputation as a player after a while, and he rather enjoyed it. And the women didn't seem to mind either, as they kept saying yes when he asked them out or when he asked them to stay the night. Donald now felt quite accomplished in the romance area, even though he had 1 failed marriage and a broken engagement under his belt. Thankfully, none of those relationships had resulted in the birth of a child. He was content with his life at this point in time. He was free. He had money. He had his own law firm. He golfed from spring through early fall and had a membership at University Ridge in Madison and did a Southern Gold tour every winter. He had the nicest house on 15 acres of prime hunting land on the outskirts of Farmerton. He had almost everything a man could ever desire. He could seemingly have any woman he wanted, every woman except Millie Paulson. She was the only female since his failed attempts to ask a girl out in high school who had ever said no to him. Who did she think she was? Of course, she started with the old "I'm married" routine, but so had a dozen other women with whom he eventually shared his bed. He couldn't figure her out, and he couldn't figure out what she saw in Charles Paulson. How could anyone choose Charles over him? He shook his head as he headed out the door. If Millie had agreed to let him stay the night after the party, his cell phone went off, interrupting his thoughts. "I'll be right there," he said, and put his phone in his pocket. "And now you're dead."
All right, thank you, Kathy. And thank you to all of our authors for reading this afternoon. So we've got about 15-20 minutes for our audience Q&A. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it in the chat and I'll make sure it gets asked. Oh, not a question, but we do have a really lovely comment from Judy. She says, "I enjoyed the humor in your reading, Jill, and look forward to reading your book. Shawn, your protagonists and plot sound intriguing. Kathy, it was fun to hear your reading a part of the book I've read already, and then some I hadn't read. Thanks, Atmosphere Press, for this event." Thank you, Judy. Give people a few moments to be typing. Oh, we have a question for all 3 authors. This is from Cam. Did you write your books linearly from the start to finish, or did you write the scenes piecemeal and then put them in order later? Maybe if you want to start, Kathy.
In a linear, pretty much a linear fashion, because I never know what's going to happen. All of a sudden, these people kind of become real, and then I just watch what they're doing and then write it down. Every once in a while, I might think ahead, like something, or something comes to my mind that this is happening to so-and-so, and I might write it down and put it in. But otherwise, just kind of get going and just can't stop.
Yeah. Jill, do you have some thoughts to add about that?
I started with something of a partial outline, just to kind of block the whole thing, and then started writing linearly. What I found, though, was I think anybody who reads a lot of mysteries knows there are unwritten rules about how a mystery has to, what it has to include, what it can't include, etc. And I realized as I went along that I needed additional scenes with certain characters to help fill things out, and to provide enough background, and in some cases maybe a red herring. So it was more or less linear with some scenes added in as I went.
Yeah, for sure. How about you, Shawn? Shawn, I think you might still be muted.
Mhm.
The question was, do you write your books from start to finish, or do you tend to write scenes piecemeal and then put them in order later?
This was my first attempt at a nonfiction, rather at a fiction book, come to think of it. It involved all the above. It was linear, it was circle-linear, it was piecemeal, and I'm surprised it ever got done.
Yeah, I'm sure sometimes it feels like a beast, really, to put together a whole book like that, but
It gets easier each time.
good to know.
I'm glad to hear that. I have to write another one.
I actually have a question for all of you. I could tell just from the readings today and, you know, what I know about your books outside of this, that you all write with narrators that have very strong personalities, whether it's one narrator for the whole book, as in Jill's book, or multiple narrators or multiple perspectives that you sort of jump between. So I was curious to know, is that something you sort of have to put in later, like you go through and you try to add that personality, or does it come pretty naturally from the get-go? If any of you want to chime in on that.
For me, it was mostly Peter Straw telling the story, but it didn't make any sense to have only the one perspective. So you had to find out what Aristotle thought and, you know, some human perspectives as well, too. So it was just a matter of having, you know, one primary point of view, I guess, but surrounded with a couple others to bounce off and interact with and hopefully complement.
Yeah, for sure.
Felice sort of grew organically. I decided early on to do first person and to stick with it because I thought the whole book is about how this person who's never done this sort of thing before gets involved in helping to investigate a murder and helping to solve it. And I wanted there to be a lot of her thought and hopefully some humor mixed in with it. That does create some problems because when you are doing purely first person, as I think Shawn alluded to, you really have to stick with what that person sees. There were thankfully only one or two places where I had to break away, and really only one, where I had to describe something that where she was not actually there.
And Kathy, any
Well,
thoughts?
I think in my previous books, I had it more through one main character. And in this book, sometimes Joe does a lot of the narrating of the story, but there were so many people in the choir and this and that I had to kind of jump around with different perspectives and things like that. So it was a little different than some of the other things I've written.
For sure, yeah.
And
Especially since you said you have this other series, but this is your first mystery novel. It's kind of an adjustment.
Right.
Yeah. If anyone else has any questions they want to put in the chat, I'll be watching there for that, or any other comments too. And if any of you three have any questions for anyone of the other three, or the other two, I should say.
I have a question for Shawn, if he's actually thought of this crossing over a number of genres, including fantasy and science fiction and things like that. I mean, you know, and to make sure to promote it in such a way as well, because those are huge markets. So.
What was your question?
Well, I don't know. I guess, have you ever considered, or that it crosses over a number of different genres, including fantasy, science fiction, and if you thought about promoting it as such?
No, I actually think of it as a science fiction fantasy book. It was Fran's idea to call it a Peter Straw third eye mystery novel. She just kind of plucked that out of the air one day. And I thought, well, you know, Peter Straw is a detective. And the truth is, Peter Straw wanted to be a detective since he was a little boy. So, and it does involve a lot of cops and criminals. And I thought, you know, it is kind of a mystery.
Mhm,
So I thought, well, calling it a science fiction fantasy mystery,
mhm.
I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah,
So I mean, I am such a novice at this. I mean, we're just, you know, trying to figure out ways to promote it now. Obviously, connecting with Atmosphere Press is, you know, the first really serious step that we've taken
mhm.
in that regard. Was it you who was saying read in front of book clubs and craft fairs and
Yes.
stuff?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think
Yeah,
everybody,
well,
yeah.
in groups, yeah, book clubs and things like that. And yeah.
When I first wrote this, when I first published it on Amazon, when it was self-published, it's an older version and I'm embarrassed to read it now, but I would call up blind groups like the, you know, South Washington State Council for the Blind and say, hey, I have this goal of introducing a blind hero into science fiction fantasy. And they'd say, oh, well, why don't you come to one of our Zoom meetings and tell us about that? So
Yeah.
I did that 5 or 6 times and we sold some books. I mean, like you say, whenever you give a talk, it's always going to be somebody or a couple of somebody's that's going to be, you know, curious enough or good-hearted enough or, you know, generous enough or merciful enough to read the book. So, but, you know, it kind of languished. And so I did connect Atmosphere Press. And I have to say that the assistance I got was enormously important. I mean, it forced me, I was forced by Bryce Wilson, who was my main editor there, to restructure the entire book, to throw it about 10-15%, to get rid of all the redundancy, all the preachy nonsense, and just, you know, have action with, so that was extraordinarily helpful because like I was very good at writing psychological reports for judges and lawyers. But, you know, breaking into this book market thing is a whole new trip. It's really hard.
I know the feeling.
Yes.
You know, when I say in the bio, because it didn't make sense to, you know, anyway, I kept the bio short and, but I spent decades writing and I am an attorney. So I spent decades writing memos, congressional testimony, newsletters, briefs, you know, and then it started in journalism. So, you know, newscasts, stories, and all of it was nonfiction. Despite what they tell you about lobbyists, everything I wrote was nonfiction.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, turning to this is a whole different way of being. And this first one, you know, it was a long, slow crawl. I have to tell the story of how this started, just because.
Yes.
I think it's sort of funny. We lived in a small town in Oregon. I was engaged in city government. And as I said, I spent 20 years as a lobbyist in Washington. I get along with almost anybody because you have to. You can't take anything personally. Everything is professional. But there was a woman engaged in city government who was driving me absolutely batty. Ethics violations, legal violations, just running roughshod over everything. And, you know, you don't expect to be in a small town when you don't really have a job and be stressed. And I was. So I finally thought, you know, the best way to deal with this is to write, because writing has always been an outlet. I came home one day and I sat down and I wrote 1,000 words on how to kill her.
No, I like that.
No, it was a wonderful way to get rid of her without any legal consequences. And then it wasn't until probably a couple of years later that I heard about NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month, and thought, I wonder if I can do something with that. And I went back and found it. And then from then on, it was again, it was another 2 years before it turned into something that resembled a book.
Wow, fact really does inspire fiction.
Yes, that's great. That's great.
We actually have another question for all three of you. So Judy says, I particularly enjoy humor in mystery novels. It sounds as if all of you successfully added humor to your books. Is that difficult to add?
Not for me.
pretty
I mean,
natural.
it's got to be there. I mean, you know, when I would write psychological evaluations of, you know, a couple of serial killers or mass murderers, I always tried to get in just a little humor. It couldn't be overdone because you don't want to overdo that. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but I think that whatever it is, humor is only going to improve it. The books that I'm trying to write, this first one, the underlying serious theme is, what would it be like for a dog, a dolphin, a chimp to acquire human level consciousness? In addition to the forensic psychology thing, I was very much into the neuropsychology thing, and dog brains, dolphin brains, chimpanzee nervous systems. This kind of stuff is really extraordinarily interesting to me. And I do believe that within a few decades, there will be this kind of synthetic brain stuff that'll make it possible to augment these creatures, at least to some extent. So the underlying serious question in How the Blind Detective and a Seeing Eye Dog Save the Narwhals is, what would it be like for these critters to find themselves having acquired human level consciousness? But, you know, inevitably, that's going to bring up a million funny things right off. I mean, if you check out, you know, porpoise culture, I mean, porpoise males are the most sexually promiscuous buggers on the planet. I mean, they're just something. And, you know, chimps, you know, so what I really try to do, my next book is coming out October 15, Demons, The Great White North and the Blind Detective, and I'm trying to write the third one now. But in all of these books, I attempt to deal with really, really serious issues like consciousness and the nature of evil, but to do it with the lightest possible touch and getting in as much humor as one can get in when you're talking about things like life and death, you know, evil and good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
I think
for me, humor it's got to be there.
I think if you're, well, I mean, mysteries need to be somewhat serious, or otherwise you're just sort of blowing up the genre and you're not really respecting your reader. But in my case, the underlying serious theme was Felice is extremely concerned about what the effect of the killing of the mayor and subsequent events have on the community, because the community is already on the razor's edge, as are so many communities in the United States who are, you know, small, who have been affected by the whole internet shopping experience, et cetera, that it's changed our society so much. And for the small towns, there's a real danger.
Right.
So she's very concerned about that. But the humor in my book, I think, is mostly internal, because Felice sees humor in a lot of things and she's snarky. So a lot of it, I think, perhaps a fair amount of it's in italics, but hopefully it's there for people to enjoy.
Mhm. I agree. I don't think I purposely tried to put any in, but I think it's just kind of who I am and how the way I would react with people naturally. But I agree with both of you that you have to have that, you have to have some kind of humor in there, because otherwise it can be pretty dark. I mean, people are dying and there are other issues involved. So, yes.
And there's a lot
More
of
natural.
absurdity.
Yeah, so yeah, it's really great to hear about that, because I agree, Kathy. I think something like this could be, I mean, something like the mystery genre can get really heavy, and it's good to have that balance. So yeah, I think that was a great way to round out this afternoon's event. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Shawn, Fran, Jill, and Kathy for your words and your brains, and of course your generosity with your time today. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It was very nice to meet you, Jill and Kathy. Hope to meet
Yes, very nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone in the audience for being here with us to celebrate all of these fabulous authors. Don't forget that you can order Narwhals, The Summer Festival is Murder, and In the Secret Heart from the links in the chat. And please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, to sign up for our email newsletter, or to submit a book manuscript of your own. Feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. We look forward to hearing from you. And that's it. Have a safe
Great.
and wonderful close to your weekend, everyone. Good
Thanks, guys.
afternoon.
Too. Bye-bye.
Bye.